I think people are perverts. That's the foundation of my career.
It's unlikely that Fincher could conquer Hollywood today. Questionable themes, being a dictator on set, long production process, and an open challenge to the mainstream audience. Actors would run from the director to avoid turning into a Fincher bitch, and the box office results of his films rarely satisfied the studios. But Fincher still became a cult director in Hollywood. How did that happen? Which actor saved Fincher's career? Why did Panic Room really become one for Jodie Foster? And what's the connection between Fincher, Robert Downey Jr., and bottles of urine? This is Hollywood lore. Let's go. Fincher got addicted to cinema at the age of 8. He started running around making random films on an 8mm camera. By a fortunate turn of events, his family's house was next door to George Lucas, and this connection played its part. Fincher first worked as a visual effects producer, assistant cameraman, and a photographer for composite shots, working on Lucas projects like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Return of the Jedi. In the latter, as he said, all the chicken walkers and tanks were his work. At one point, David got into producing music videos and commercials. Not just getting into it, but becoming one of the most famous in the field and founding a company to produce them. In this very company, the careers of Zack Snyder, Spike Jonze, Michael Gondry, Gore Verbinski, Michael Bay, and others began. Fincher was so successful in the music video industry that by 1990, 3 out of 4 slots in the Best Video category at the MTV Awards were taken up by his work. He filmed for Aerosmith, Michael Jackson, Billy Idol, Paula Abdul, George Michael, and Madonna. For her, he created some of the most iconic music videos. Fincher also worked on commercials for Pepsi, Chanel, Nike, Coca-Cola, and other brands, never pretending he was enjoying it though. So, in short, Fincher was already well known in the right circles. That's precisely why they brought him in to direct Alien 3 in 1990. All the major directors turned down the project, immediately feeling the studio's unprecedented pressure. 20th Century Fox decided to hire a talented but not too well-known guy who wouldn't mind the pressure and would just do the studio's bidding. They thought this guy was Fincher.
He's not the guy.
Poor bastards. We've already covered the full story in our video about the Alien franchise. The script was constantly being rewritten by some studio jerks who were not happy about something. And Fincher quickly grew tired of it and started shooting the way he thought was best. When they tried to discipline him and fire him, Sigourney Weaver stepped in to defend the director, and the studio had to back off. This battle carried on throughout the 2-year shoot, exhausting everyone involved in the project. And it seemed Fincher was the one most affected. He often said there was nothing in his life he hated more than making Alien 3. So when the movie was finished, the director quickly got the hell out of there and didn't even bother with the editing. Someone else did that. He completely disowned what eventually made it to theaters, and still suspiciously looks at anyone who tells him they loved that third Alien movie. In these moments, there's always a silent question in his eyes.
Why are you the way that you are?
By the way, Fincher was repeatedly offered to release a director's cut, but he declined, insisting it would require reshooting everything. And even if he had the opportunity, he wouldn't have done it, out of pure hatred and disgust. How much Alien 3 cost is debatable. Some say it was $50 million, but Fincher himself has said in interviews that he pissed away $60 million on it. Yes, he says it just like that. There's even information suggesting it was $75 million. But anyways, at the box office in 1992, it made $160. If the budget was $50 million, that's not bad. But if it was closer to $75, then things aren't looking so great. So Fincher's setup was like this: the possible financial failure, the mixed reviews, and the newly acquired enemy in the form of 20th Century Fox. It's bloody surprising his career wasn't wasted right then and there. But there were 2 reasons this didn't happen. The first was Sigourney Weaver. She constantly crap-talked the studio and praised the director. The second reason was the producer Arnold Coppelson, who had already fought Fox and wanted to prove to the damn corpo bastards that they were just a bunch of miserable idiots. A small spoiler here, he nailed it. In just a couple years, Fox will be begging Fincher to film another project for them, but we'll get to that. But back then, Coppelson, driven by this noble and solid plan for the future, called Fincher to direct his Project 7 in 1994. After Alien, Fincher was calmly working on commercials and didn't expect to be offered another movie to direct. He wasn't exactly eager either, remembering the hell the studio had put him through during shooting. But when David received the script for 7, he was so captivated by this dark epic and its bold ending that he decided to take the risk again. Ironically, it turned out that what he'd received wasn't the final version of the script, but one of the 10 drafts Andrew Kevin Walker had written, which wasn't even meant to be seriously considered. Fincher, however, insisted on this specific version with the box surprise ending, and little did he know how much nerve cells it would cost him to defend it. Morgan Freeman was the first actor to sign on. Producer Arnold Coppelson showed him the script. Freeman quickly got in touch with Fincher and agreed to play Detective Somerset. Initially, they'd wanted to cast Al Pacino, but he turned it down, later regretting it. But it wasn't just Pacino. Denzel Washington was initially tipped for the role of Detective Mills, but upon reading the script, he declined too. Same happened to Sylvester Stallone, and both actors were very upset about their decisions later. Brad Pitt agreed to join because he wanted to be in something more serious and not as cheesy as Legends of the Fall. The actor wanted to play a character in a spooky film with a mature rating, to get away from the image of a chick magnet. To achieve that, he even refused to take his shirt off in 7. Spoiler, it didn't help. Brad still won an MTV award for being the sexiest and most desirable that year. Once Pitt and Freeman were on board, New Line Studio took over the project and immediately heard Fincher's terms, keeping the ending as it was and give him full creative control. The studio was shocked by these demands from the young director, but when Freeman and Pitt supported Fincher, the studio backed off. Pitt even got involved in the casting for the role of John Doe. Both he and Fincher liked Kevin Spacey for the part, but the studio said he was too pricey. When Pitt heard about it, he called the studio and said something unknown, but supposedly nasty to them. And the money magically appeared. Fincher wasn't sure the movie would be successful. In fact, he thought it would fail. But he told the actors they'd be proud of the project at least. True, Pitt still considers 7 one of the most perfect films he's ever worked on. But let's be honest, Pitt himself had a hand in that success. More specifically, his hand helped to keep the studio bosses away from Fincher. When the test screenings came in, the audience fell into a catatonic stupor after the finale, demanding a living happily ever after ending for everyone. New Line Studio had a panic attack and went back to Fincher, insisting on removing the suspicious box from the film and adding a triumph of justice. Pitt again stood up for the director, telling the studio to piss off and let the talented people do their job. What came out of this, as we all know, was global hype, placement on best of lists, legacy, cult status, and of course, the immortal
The box, who's in the box?
With a budget of $33 million, 7 grossed $328 worldwide and ranked 7th amongst the highest-grossing films of the year. Ironically, 7 years later in 2002, the studio offered a sequel titled 8, obviously. But the entire cast refused to return, and Fincher said he'd rather have burning cigarettes shoved in his eyes than make this sequel. The movie was Solace, starring Anthony Hopkins, and it didn't even make it to wide release, going straight to video.
That is one big pile of shit.
Alongside 7, Fincher was working on another film, The Game with Michael Douglas. This is the second most disliked of Fincher's films by Fincher himself. While The Game had a significantly larger budget than 7, a considerable portion of that was taken by Michael Douglas, and Fincher constantly found himself running out of money.
Greed is good.
There were also problems with the cast. Originally, Jodie Foster was set to play the daughter of the main character, but Michael Douglas rejected it and suggested changing the daughter into a sister. Foster objected, saying like, "What the hell, Michael? We have a 20-year age gap and that's just stupid." While the actors were debating, Foster landed the role in Contact and left. The main character then got a brother instead of a sister, and Sean Penn was cast for this role. Later, Foster sued the studio for not putting her in the film as promised, demanding $50 million in compensation. The case never went to trial though, and the issues with the actress were settled, likely involving a sum with 6 zeros. Ironically, her next attempt at working with Fincher won't go quite as smoothly. Douglas later said the shoot was tough because Fincher was already playing around with millions of takes to get that perfect result. In the end, it took 6 months to shoot, compared to just a month for 7. The game also showcased Fincher's established style, the desire to avoid the pink tones on screen. The director later said that's intentional, because magenta at the lower end of the color spectrum is a favorite trick of monitor manufacturers to make people on screen look like healthy, happy little pigs. Fincher just hates this idea and works hard to destroy it in his films. Drop a like and subscribe if you didn't know that. While in 7, the director successfully avoided the pink piggies and hit the jackpot. In the game, the trick didn't work. Well, it did for critics and some viewers, but not the box office results. The original budget ballooned from $40 million to $50 million, and the movie only made $109. Regardless, that somewhat disappointing result didn't impact Fincher's career. Somewhere around the late 90s, he was offered to direct Spider-Man, which Sam Raimi later took on. David explained his refusal by saying he makes films with an adult rating, and in his version of Spider-Man, Aunt May would have been the murderer of Uncle Ben and Mary Jane would have been a toxic, manipulative psycho making Parker's life a nightmare. Hold on a second. Well, anyway, Spider-Man didn't seem interesting to Fincher, but Fight Club did. We've already talked a lot about this movie, with enthusiasm and passion, in our videos about Edward Norton and Brad Pitt. Hardcore movie fans might know that Fight Club is a 20th Century Fox film. This raises the question, how, after the horrors of Alien 3, did David Fincher agree to work with these assholes again, whom he hated with all his soul?
Fox is the #1 studio in the country because they're all such a bunch of morons.
And the answer was simple. They wanted him so badly that they set him up with the head of the studio and promised they wouldn't interfere. But there was a catch. They just didn't account for what kind of film this was gonna be. Fincher later claimed he gave everyone a detailed storyboard describing exactly what would happen in the movie. And at that meeting, everyone nodded without asking too many questions. But when they saw the same thing on screen during the final viewing, those same people started sweating, twitching in their chairs, and imagining how they'd be looking for a new job after releasing such a movie. The director used about 4 times more tape for Fight Club than would be used for any other studio project in 1999. But that's Fincher's style, wasting the tape, reshooting the same scene hundreds of times. For the voiceover of the sex scene, Pitt and Bonham Carter spent 3 days in the studio, endlessly moaning at each other. The final budget of Fight Club ended up being $63 million, not $60 as was initially intended. And in the box office it made $101, clearly not covering its costs. However, it did very well on home media, and it's reported that it became one of the best-selling DVDs in 20th Century Fox's history. So, in time, the studio not only gained an iconic classic in their library, but likely made some profit from it as well. After Fight Club, Fincher spent a long time searching for a new project, one that was more compact, where he wouldn't have to move around to 100 different locations. Because of this, he turned down Hannibal and Catch Me If You Can. Fincher was shooting the light chamber movie Panic Room for 6 months, and almost drove Jodie Foster insane. Initially, she wasn't even considered for the part. Sandra Bullock was the first choice. But Bullock quickly declined, suspecting she'd have to do countless takes and spend much more time on set than usual. Angelina Jolie could have taken the role, but she was too young, so they passed. Fincher then settled on Nicole Kidman, and was thrilled. Like, with her in the film, he would have a true Hitchcockian thriller vibe. But just before shooting began, Kidman dropped out due to scheduling conflicts, and Jodie Foster was brought in instead. David was disappointed, realizing that Foster's character had more of a tough Claire Starling feel than a fragile Grace Kelly type he had in mind, the one that would have helped him to recreate the desired Hitchcock aura. This change also resulted in some practical challenges. The props were designed with Kidman in mind, and she was nearly 6 feet tall. Foster, on the other hand, was significantly shorter. So the lasers at the entrance to the panic room kept shining directly into Foster's eyes, causing her to mess up several takes. Also, Kristen Stewart, who started filming at a similar height to Foster, kept growing, and by the end of the shoot, she was towering over Foster like a freaking mega tsunami. This required a lot of work with camera angles to make it look right. The height issue could be managed with this, but Foster's pregnancy became impossible to hide at some point. The filming had to be stopped for 6 months. So technically, the shoot lasted for almost a year in total, making it the longest shoot in Foster's career at the time. Fincher paid no attention to the actors' or studio's complaints. If it took 103 takes to get a shot of a bag sliding across the floor, so be it. If the budget needed to be increased by a third to make the film look more realistic, okay, just give more money and shut the hell up. If a scene needed to be shot without special effects, sure, let's go. Actors, handle this crap, would you please? In the end, the film cost $48 million and earned $197. Pretty legit result. The reviews from critics and audiences weren't as glowing this time, though not disastrous either. In 2005, Fincher was offered to direct a new Batman, but he wasn't interested. By that time, Batman movies had a certain reputation. Not a good one, that is. So it's understandable why the director wasn't eager to become a part of such a suspicious project. Fincher was more interested in making something darker about a mysterious killer, so he turned to James Ellroy's book about the Black Dahlia case. He planned it as a 5-hour miniseries with big stars and a budget of around $80 million, but no one was willing to fund this nonsense. In 2005, it seemed pretty stupid, and that's pretty hilarious when you think about it now. So, after crying a bit over the Black Dahlia, Fincher decided to go with something similar and put Robert Downey Jr. and Jake Gyllenhaal through some trouble as a nice bonus. At that time, Robert had no Iron Man yet, just years of nasty behavior and a very questionable reputation, so he was willing to take anything. Zodiac seemed to be a lucky break for Downey Jr. Fincher initially wanted Daniel Craig for the role of journalist Paul Avery, but the actor dropped out. Fincher, however, didn't let go of the idea of Craig as a journalist, as we would see in the near future. After Craig left, the director approached Brad Pitt, and Brad seemed to agree. But Fincher was making so many calibrations during pre-production that Pitt eventually lost his temper and bailed. It was only then that the role was offered to Downey Jr., who happily accepted, having no idea what awaits him. Jake Gyllenhaal was chosen right away. Fincher later mentioned that if Jake had declined, Orlando Bloom would have suffered instead. From the feedback of the actors working on the film, it's clear all those jokes about suffering were not jokes at all. Fincher had complete creative control on the project, with only one condition. The movie had to be no longer than 2.5 hours. Fincher's solution was simple. David asked the actors to speed up their dialogue delivery.
Not quite my tempo.
They spoke quickly, reshooting hundreds of takes until Fincher saw this very one and only. Later, the director explained his behavior, saying he wanted the actors to truly immerse themselves in their roles, looking natural, not just going through the motions and relying on muscle memory that had won them 10 Oscars in the past. The actors didn't appreciate this philosophy. While Mark Ruffalo and Jake Gyllenhaal quietly cried in some dusty corner after the shoot, Downey Jr. decided to rebel openly. He chose an extravagant method. The actor hid bottles and cans filled with his urine on set. Fincher later laughed when talking about it. Downey Jr. eventually gave in, stopped urinating in bottles, and dutifully played everything as required. Zodiac was supposed to be cheaper, but Fincher stayed true to himself. A lot of efforts went into post-production. Blood at the crime scenes? Totally digital. Urine bottles? Vanished. Even Jake Gyllenhaal's hands were altered. Fincher thought they were too nice and delicate, so they added some manly hair. The movie cost $67 million, and it made a modest $84 at the box office. The film started decently, landing in second place in the charts. But by the next week, it dropped to fifth place, losing out to 300, Bridge to Terabithia, and Nicolas Cage's attempt to become a hotshot biker. By the fourth week, Zodiac had completely fallen out of the top 15. This flop didn't affect the director's career, however. First, because the reviews from both critics and audiences were decent. And second, because by then, Fincher was already busy with The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. This film could have been directed by Steven Spielberg, Ron Howard, or even Spike Jonze. If Spielberg had directed it, Tom Cruise would have played the lead role. If Ron Howard, it would have been John Travolta. But eventually the project ended up in David's hands. It's objectively his least Fincher-like film, both in terms of tone and the age rating, which for the first time in the director's career was not R but PG-13. Brad Pitt convinced Fincher to take on this kid stuff. The actor was very eager to portray Benjamin, and the director couldn't say no to his friend. At first, Fincher wanted to cast Rachel Weisz as Pitt's partner, but she couldn't participate due to a scheduling conflict, so the role was offered to Cate Blanchett. The film was highly praised by critics, receiving numerous nominations, including Oscars. It didn't win much, however, and most of the awards were technical. As for the box office, the results were not great, not terrible. The film earned $336 million with a budget of $150, making it Fincher's most expensive project. In 2007, David could have directed The Passengers and The Time Traveler's Wife. He was interested in both projects, but his bold ideas for killing off all the characters or at least making them suffer unimaginably were rejected by the studios. What Fincher needed was a hit, not to save his career since his films always received excellent reviews from both critics and audiences, but to continue receiving the solid budgets he got used to. And Fincher finally got this necessary hit in 2010. For The Social Network, Fincher clearly compromised some of his principles. He shortened the runtime after test screenings and later reshot some scenes to get a PG-13 rating, even though the film was initially intended to be rated R. Other than that, it was still good old David as we know and love. He didn't stop torturing the actors, though he did it with slightly less drive than in Zodiac. Instead of hundreds of takes for one scene, Fincher settled for just 40. Some actors still suffered even with this grace, like Armie Hammer. He later said he had to eat nothing but burgers to avoid losing weight from endless takes, especially for rowing scenes. Fincher wanted to cast Shia LaBeouf for the role of Mark Zuckerberg at first, but LaBeouf turned it down. After that, Andrew Garfield started to run around the director, and Fincher was fine with this option, until he saw Jesse Eisenberg at one of the auditions. David then told Garfield, "You're a great guy, but you're too empathetic, too likable, not creepy enough. So play Eduardo, those qualities are needed there." Released in 2010, The Social Network cost $50 million, made $225, and spent several weeks at the top of the box office. The financial success was accompanied by critical praise. Fincher received his only Golden Globe for the film, along with a ton of Oscar nominations. Fincher didn't linger on his success for long though, and the following year, in 2011, he released The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. For this movie, the director managed to finally snag Daniel Craig and get him to play the journalist, just like David had wanted since Zodiac. But casting the actress for the role of the tattooed dame was much more complicated. Initially, Fincher chose Natalie Portman, but she'd already been destroyed by Darren Aronofsky in Black Swan and needed a break. Scarlett Johansson and Jennifer Lawrence were dismissed by Fincher himself. He found the first one too doll-like and the second one too tall. Somewhere along the way, the director remembered Rooney Mara, with whom he had enjoyed working on The Social Network. The studio didn't appreciate his choice, but Mara was determined to get the role. To prove her commitment, she followed Fincher's suggestion, got herself super loaded, spent the entire night throwing up in the bathroom, and then let Fincher photograph her. He later showed those photos to the studio, convincing them that's the actress they were looking for. During filming, the actress developed a love for dieting, smoking, riding motorcycles, and wandering on set with her breasts exposed. When journalists asked her about the sacrifices she was making for the role, she answered it was required, she enjoyed it, adored Fincher for this project, and would follow him to hell if needed. This desire may also have been influenced by receiving an Oscar nomination for the role, but that's not certain. The film didn't meet the studio's expectations, making $233 million against a budget of $90. Critics and audiences were thrilled as freaking usual, though some felt that certain cast members spoiled the ending a bit too much, if you know what we mean. The high praise sparked conversations about a sequel, but the studio insisted on seriously cutting the budget. Fincher found these talks to be a pain in the butt and quickly deltaed the hell away. The sequel was eventually made 7 years later, titled The Girl in the Spider's Web. It had different actors and a different director. The film cost $43 million to make, grossing only $35, effectively ending any future attempts to continue the uneasy story of Blomkvist and Lisbeth on screen. Probably the talks about budget cuts were already giving Fincher an itchy feeling, plus he had long been dreaming of a TV series. So in 2013, he left to direct House of Cards for Netflix. The streaming service needed to attract subscribers, and they were extra generous, handing out $5 million per episode, which brought the total budget for the first season to around $100 million. Kevin Spacey received $1 million per episode, and Robin Wright wasn't far behind. What attracted Fincher to TV shows was the ability to develop characters more thoroughly than in movies, thanks to the longer runtime. So when the director saw the 1990 British series House of Cards, he immediately jumped on the opportunity to adapt it, ultimately creating one of Netflix's flagship shows. The service has repeatedly thanked Fincher for such a powerful exclusive. Alongside House of Cards, the director was also working on Gone Girl, a film about a grudge, as Fincher himself calls it, and an adaptation of Gillian Flynn's book. The lead female role was given to Rosamund Pike, with Fincher justifying his choice by saying that, first of all, it's hard to determine her age based on her appearance. Secondly, it was difficult for him to figure her out like other actors and actresses, which David found strange, and that funny feeling was just it. The final choice of Ben Affleck, Fincher explained as, the dude understands what it's like to be the public's punching bag. So Fincher thought that would add some vibe. Affleck was so excited about working with David that he postponed filming for Live by Night. However, the actor's joy lasted exactly until the moment he had to wear a Yankees cap for a scene. And he refused, stating he would rather eat a glass because he'd supported their rivals his whole life. Ben and Fincher had catfights for 3 days over this bloody cap, until David finally gave up and switched the Yankees cap for a Mets one, later calling the actor's behavior incredibly childish. During 100 days of shooting, Fincher filmed 500 hours of footage. All the actors suffered on set as usual, and Affleck later joked that he'd become a true Fincher bitch, following all the director's commands without much complaint. The only actor to vocalize his dissatisfaction was Tyler Perry. Upon signing on for the project, he knew nothing about the book the film was based on, nor about Fincher and his appeal to actors. Had he known, he said he never would have agreed. Gone Girl became Fincher's highest-grossing film. With a budget of $61 million, it made $370, and stayed in the top 10 at the box office for 10 weeks. The film received a ton of nominations, including an Oscar for Rosamund Pike for Best Actress. But in the end, no major awards were taken. After that, Fincher fully immersed himself in Netflix, working on 2 series, Mindhunter and Love, Death, and Robots. Mindhunter was cancelled, and Fincher mentioned this decision was made due to financial reasons. The production costs were too high, and too few people were watching the show. On the set of this one, by the way, Fincher also managed to torment the actors with endless takes, and rumor has it the scene where the main character meets Edmund Kemper was specifically hated by the cast. In 2018, David could have directed a sequel to World War Z, which Brad Pitt brought him on board for. Everything seemed set, but then the shooting was cancelled just a couple of weeks before the start. The reason is complicated. One version suggests that money was once again the deciding factor. The first movie barely broke even at the box office, and the sequel was expected to have a budget of $150 million, which with Fincher on board might have been enlarged by another $30 million. In 2020, David directed Mank with Gary Oldman, and the movie garnered a generous number of Oscar and Golden Globe nominations. Some critics even said it was the best film of Fincher's entire career. Despite such sweet-talking, the film won just a couple of technical Oscars, again. Fincher had wanted to make Mank for over 20 years, but studios had turned him down when they learned he intended to shoot the film in black and white. Either Netflix remembered the success of the artist, or they were simply gracious to Fincher, but either way, they didn't refuse David and financed Mank. The latest film by Fincher is The Killer with Michael Fassbender. Perhaps David chose Fassbender in part because of their shared Vietnamese flashbacks after working on the Alien franchise. The Killer is once again a Netflix film, based on a graphic novel. The film's budget is unknown, but it's estimated to be between $100 and $120 million. Some even claim it's 175, but that sounds pretty insane, as the film doesn't appear to justify such a hefty price tag. The Killer has received mixed reviews from critics and audiences, but lately more and more glowing reviews are surfacing, claiming the film is not as simple, to the point of stating it's almost a second Fight Club. Time will tell if this is true or not. And in general, time shows a lot of things, including what will come of the movie Strangers, where Fincher is currently listed as the director. The script is being written by Ben Affleck and Gillian Flynn, the author of Gone Girl. The film, as is typical for Fincher, is about murder, mystery, and 2 men. So all the hints of his former greatness are already present in the early script details. Strangers is currently in pre-production, and given Fincher's pace, we can assume that we might see it in 2 or 3 years, at the very best. Of course, that's if everything goes according to plan. The film gets released, Fincher avoids Tarantino's director age rule and manages to produce something worth watching, and Affleck doesn't spiral into booze over Jennifer Lopez. Thanks, and see you next time.